You've navigated forbidden bath nights and questionable fashion choices, but don't relax just yet, because now the court needs witnesses. And in this next trial, those witnesses might just be animals, or insects, or a cheese wheel. Yes, you heard right. Welcome to the weird world of non-human legal testimony in medieval Europe. Let's set the stage. A farmer accuses his neighbor of stealing hens. There are no human witnesses, and neither party will budge. But wait, didn't the thief's ox act strangely the night the chickens disappeared? Did the dog bark at the wrong time? Did the cheese on the shelf mysteriously crack in two the moment someone told a lie? Believe it or not, these were acceptable lines of legal reasoning in some local courts, especially rural ones. Superstition, folk wisdom, and theology all got tangled up in the justice system, and sometimes that meant letting animals speak, or at least interpreting their behavior as testimony. There are recorded cases where the behavior of a cat was treated as meaningful evidence. In one French village, a court determined that a man was a thief because a local cat refused to go near him. Yes, trial by feline vibes. Even more peculiar in parts of Switzerland and the Italian Alps, witnesses once brought cheese wheels into court. Why? Because it was believed that cheese could break in response to lies. A person would place their hand on a wheel of fresh cheese, speak their statement, and then watch. If the cheese cracked, oozed, or shrank, that was seen as divine judgment. Cheese never lies. Insects, too, could make appearances not to speak, but to stand trial. If a field was infested with weevils or locusts, farmers might demand a trial, and church officials would formally issue summonses to the insects. These were real documents penned in Latin, ordering the bugs to vacate the premises by a certain date. Failure to comply could result in excommunication or formal curses from the pulpit. Historians still argue whether this was meant to be taken seriously or if it was mostly symbolic, an effort to reinforce human control over nature by putting it through legal rituals. Either way, the ceremonies were elaborate. In some towns, entire processions were formed to deliver the summons to the accused bugs, which were then represented in absentia by a lawyer appointed to defend them. The weevils naturally never showed. And while we're on the topic of absurd courtroom logic, consider this: in some witchcraft trials, animals were called as evidence. A familiar say, a black cat or toad could be examined for marks, unusual behaviors, or simply its general vibe. If it looked too clever or too affectionate, it might be taken as proof that its owner was dealing with the devil. One bizarre 15th century case involved a goose that followed its mistress everywhere and once honked during a bishop's sermon. That alone earned the woman a trial for sorcery. The goose was locked in a pen outside the court, pending further judgment. Its fate is sadly unrecorded. And there's more. Dogs were sometimes summoned to identify murderers. If a dog reacted violently to a suspect, it was taken as a divine sign. There's even a ritual called cruentation, where a corpse was laid out in front of the accused. If the wounds began to bleed again, read natural decomposition, the person standing nearby was guilty. That's right, dead bodies were their own forensic experts. This mingling of myth, theology, and law may sound outrageous now, but remember, the medieval mind saw the universe as deeply interconnected. If God ruled the world, then surely he could speak through cheese cats or gnats. And the courtroom, like the church, was a place where divine mysteries played out in very public, very strange ways. So next time you complain about jury duty, be thankful your case doesn't hinge on a rooster's opinion, a vengeful sheep, or a block of cheddar whispering accusations. Hey guys, tonight we're unraveling some of the strangest laws ever written in the dusty scrolls and brittle parchments of medieval Europe. Picture yourself slipping into scratchy woolen tunic, your feet crunching on uneven cobblestones, and the cold breath of a candlelit chapel tickling your face as the scent of old incense clings to your clothes. But before you can sit down to confess your sins or pray for rain, the priest starts yelling. Why? Because you've brought your prize hen under your cloak, and apparently that's illegal. You see, in parts of medieval Europe, particularly in rural England and France, it was forbidden to bring chickens, geese, or any barnyard fowl into church. You might think it's just about hygiene or noise, and fair enough, squawking during Mass isn't ideal, but the real reason these animals were believed to be susceptible to demonic possession. Yes, your sweet egg-laying companion might be a devil in disguise. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Back in the 13th century, a chicken in church wasn't just a poultry problem. It could be a spiritual hazard. Imagine being hauled in front of the parish court because your rooster crowed during a funeral. Some villages imposed fines, while others took more drastic steps. In the Flemish town of Ypres, there's record of a woman being excommunicated not for murder, not for theft, but for allowing a duck to wander under the altar table during Easter Mass. This wasn't a fringe belief either. Medieval sermons often warned that Satan could take the form of common animals to disrupt holy rituals. That included black cats, of course, but also pigs, goats, and yes, chickens. So if your rooster started crowing when the host was raised, you might be accused of harboring evil. And don't think you could just cage them outside. In some places, simply bringing a chicken onto consecrated ground, churchyard included, was cause for a public scolding or a few coins in the penitential box. Think of it like a medieval version of being kicked out of a concert for filming on your phone, except instead of security guards, you've got a furious friar and eternal damnation to worry about. Historians still argue whether this law was based more in superstition or social control. Was it a theological stance against animal uncleanliness? Or just a way to keep poor farmers from crowding the front pews with their feathered companions? We may never know. But what's even weirder, in a few isolated abbeys, monks did keep chickens inside as part of symbolic rituals, especially those connected to resurrection and rebirth. In one 14th century monastery, a chicken was paraded around on Easter morning to symbolize the triumph of life over death. That's right. The same creature that might get you excommunicated elsewhere was considered a holy mascot just a few towns away. One curious detail some chicken bans specifically mentioned: egg-laying hens. Why? Because eggs were linked to fertility and female sexuality, and their sudden appearance in a sacred space might have been seen as a sign of improper thoughts. Yes, even your lunch could be sexually suspicious in the Middle Ages. So next time you're at a historical reenactment or wandering through a mossy stone chapel, just remember your ancestors had to choose between attending Mass or bringing breakfast, and God help them if they tried both. Now that you've left your poultry at the church gates, let's hope you don't get accused of a crime. Because in medieval Europe, trials didn't always look like what you'd expect. There were no sleek lawyers or 12-person juries. Instead, your fate might rest in your own blistered hands. Enter trial by hot iron. Imagine this: you're dragged into the village square, surrounded by curious neighbors whispering behind their hands. The sheriff, or maybe even the local priest, holds out a red-hot metal bar glowing like the embers of a dying fire. Your crime may be someone's bread went missing. Maybe you were in the wrong place when a noble's purse vanished. There's little evidence, no fingerprints, and certainly no CCTV, just suspicion. To prove your innocence, you must carry this burning iron rod, sometimes weighing several pounds, across a set distance, often 9 feet. You can wrap no cloth around it, no gloves, just skin to fire. Then your scorched hand is bound and sealed for 3 days. You don't unwrap it early. You don't peek. When the time is up, a priest or judge inspects the wound. If it's healing cleanly, you're innocent. If it's infected or festering, guilty. And probably in much worse shape than when you started. Sound brutal. It was. But the idea was rooted in divine judgment, that God would protect the innocent and smite the guilty right through their skin. To medieval minds, wounds that healed were proof of heavenly favor. You were quite literally putting your life in God's hands. This wasn't a fringe ritual either. Trial by ordeal was codified into law, especially in the Frankish kingdoms and early English legal systems. There was also trial by water cold or boiling trial by combat, and even ordeal by sacrament, where someone had to take communion and hope God didn't strike them down mid-swallow. And the weirdest part, people sometimes volunteered for this. If you were wrongly accused and desperate to clear your name, trial by hot iron might be the only way to stop the gossip and get your goat back, yes. Stolen livestock cases were common. One recorded case from 11th century Saxony tells of a miller's daughter accused of stealing flour. With no witnesses and no confession, she agreed to the iron. Her hand blistered, but not enough. The court declared her innocent, and she walked away a local legend. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were truly believed to be supernatural tests, or if they were more symbolic, a way to shame or acquit people when legal evidence was thin. Some suspect that priests administering the ordeal would subtly help the accused if they believed them innocent, maybe by adjusting the iron's heat or faking the distance walked. And yes, this was gendered too. Men were more often sent to trial by combat, while women were subjected to scalding water or searing iron, because apparently boiling your fingers was more ladylike than swinging a sword. The church officially banned trial by ordeal in 1215. But the practice lingered in rural areas for decades, sometimes even centuries. People feared the pain, yes, but they feared being seen as guilty even more. And if you're thinking, Hurley, they could have just talked it out. Remember, in a world without forensic science or real police, pain was the great truth teller. A blistered palm, for better or worse, was all the court needed. So next time you burn your hand on a stovetop, imagine having to convince your whole village it means you're innocent. And don't drop the iron. That's extra suspicious. You survived the hot iron ordeal, and maybe your hand's healing clean, but don't get too comfortable. Because now it's time to renew your oath of loyalty to your feudal lord. And in some parts of medieval Europe, that wasn't just a handshake and a promise. Oh no, sometimes you had to kiss his feet. Literally. Picture this, you're kneeling in a smoky great hall surrounded by armored knights and nervous peasants. Your lord draped in fur and smelling vaguely of damp leather and dried meat extends a booted foot. Or if he's feeling traditional, a bare one. You bend down the stone floor, rough beneath your knees, and press your lips to the man's crusty toes, in a very public, very solemn show of obedience, and that's if things go well. In some rare but documented cases, especially during coronations or the renewal of vassalage contracts, the ritual included prostration. You face down on the floor, arms outstretched like a human rug, while your liege either blessed you or stepped over you. Why so dramatic? Because feudalism was all about hierarchy, submission, and visible demonstrations of loyalty. You weren't just swearing fealty, you were showing everyone from your fellow peasants to the kitchen dogs exactly who owned your land, your harvest, and to some extent, your dignity. This ritual had many names: homage, fealty, baisemane, and depending on where you lived, the foot kissing could be replaced by hand kissing, or even by a symbolic exchange like offering a clod of dirt. But the principle was the same: the body must kneel so the law can stand. And don't think nobles were spared. Even kings had to bow to popes or emperors on occasion. One infamous case in 1077, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV traveled through blizzards and snowdrifts to kneel barefoot for 3 days outside Pope Gregory VII's castle in Canossa, begging for forgiveness and an end to his excommunication. The Pope made him wait just to twist the knife. Now that's some medieval power play. Historians still argue whether the physical acts of submission were truly believed to transfer authority, or if they were just elaborate theater for the watching crowd. Either way, they worked. People remembered who kissed whose feet, and they didn't forget. And yes, feet were chosen very intentionally. In medieval theology, the foot was considered the lowest, most humbling part of the body. To kiss it was to place yourself symbolically beneath the person you served. There's even a surviving English legal text that describes a rebellious baron being forced to lick the sole of his king's boot, then pay a fine in silver equal to the height of his own shame. That's poetic and kind of cruel. Not everyone went along willingly, of course. There are accounts of vassals refusing to perform the foot kiss and getting stripped of their lands, or in some cases dragged to the altar and forced into submission in front of the court. Think of it like being publicly unfollowed and doxxed in the same moment. Even stranger, some lords started delegating their toes. Yes, they sent proxies to accept homage on their behalf. You might end up kissing the ring or feet of your lord's steward squire, or even his wife. In a handful of bizarre records, peasant men were made to kneel before noble women and kiss the hem of their gown, which still counted as full submission, feminist victory. More like symbolic servitude wrapped in velvet. And yet, for all its humiliating theatrics, this ritual meant something real. Once you performed homage, your lord owed you protection, military support, land rights, legal backing. In a brutal, lawless countryside, kissing one pair of feet could mean saving your family from starvation or bandit raids. Still, next time you complain about long company meetings or awkward job interviews, imagine having to pucker up to a nobleman's unwashed foot just to keep your farm. You're back on your feet now, though, probably trying to forget whose foot you just kissed. But don't wander too far, because something strange is happening in the village square. A crowd is gathering. Children are giggling, elders are frowning, and the town bailiff is reading formal charges to a pig. That's right. You've stumbled into one of medieval Europe's strangest yet shockingly common rituals: animal trials. See if a pig killed a child, something that unfortunately did happen more than once. It didn't just result in a grieving family and a burial. It triggered a full-blown criminal investigation. The pig was arrested, imprisoned, tried in court, and if found guilty, executed. Yes, really. Take a moment to absorb that. There were official records of pigs being shackled, dressed in tiny suits, so they looked presentable and brought before a judge. A lawyer, usually appointed by the court, was tasked with defending the animal, while witnesses recounted the alleged crime. The entire trial could take days, and if convicted, the pig was publicly hanged or burned. And it wasn't just pigs. Goats, cows, horses, and even roosters stood trial across France, Switzerland, and the Holy Roman Empire. Insects too, grasshoppers, weevils, and rats were tried in absentia, usually for destroying crops. Judges would solemnly excommunicate them from the region, hoping divine forces would compel them to leave. Spoiler, it didn't work. So, why were these people just completely unhinged? Historians still argue whether the purpose of animal trials was legal, religious, or psychological. One theory holds that putting animals on trial allowed communities to project blame and process grief. A dead child couldn't be brought back, but punishing the pig gave people closure and reassured them that someone was held accountable. In religious terms, animals were seen as part of God's moral universe. If a pig committed murder, it wasn't just a random accident. It was a cosmic disruption. Punishing the pig helped restore order, like resetting the spiritual balance of the community. There's even a fringe belief that some trials were staged to mock human justice, a dark satire by clever clerics or townsfolk frustrated with the corruption of the courts. If your local magistrate was sentencing poor peasants while nobles walked free, putting a goat on trial might have been your way of saying, "Look how absurd this system is." Still, some cases were terrifyingly earnest. In 1386 in Falaise, Normandy, a sow was convicted of murdering a child and was sentenced to death. Not only was she hanged, but she was also dressed in human clothes for the execution. The record notes with chilling precision that she was garbed in a waistcoat and breeches, as if the symbolism mattered more than the act itself. And there's more. Animals weren't just tried for violence. Some were charged with indecent behavior. A man in 15th century Burgundy was arrested along with his donkey for a relationship that shall remain implied but not described. The man was hanged. The donkey, after multiple villagers testified to her good character, was acquitted. You can't make this stuff up. Sometimes the animals won. There are records of animal lawyers successfully arguing that the accused beast had been provoked, or was underfed, or had no intent to harm. These victories were celebrated in legal circles, and even studied by law students who debated whether animal willpower could exist. Even today, legal scholars occasionally dig into these strange medieval footnotes. Did people really think animals had moral agency? Or were these cases just elaborate rituals meant to soothe the community? Maybe both. One thing's certain. The next time you scold your dog for chewing your shoe, be thankful he doesn't need to appear in court wearing a tunic and facing the gallows. After watching a pig receive the medieval death sentence in full courtroom attire, you're probably starting to feel like anything is possible in this world of strange laws. And you'd be right. Because now we're diving into the fashion police, literally. Welcome to the world of forbidden fashions, where dressing too fancy could land you in hot water, or a public shaming. It's the 14th century, and you've just spent a fortune on the newest trend sweeping the merchant class shoes, so long and pointy, they have to be tied to your knees. They're called poulaines, and they make you feel important, powerful, even noble. But there's a problem. You're a blacksmith. And according to local sumptuary laws, you're not allowed to wear anything that makes you look wealthier than you are. Sumptuary laws were a kind of fashion-based caste system. Passed by monarchs and city councils across Europe, they dictated what people could and couldn't wear based on social class, profession, gender, and even marital status. Want to wear purple silk? Too bad it's reserved for royalty. Fancy fur trim only if you're a nobleman. Gold thread. Forget it unless you've got a title and land. These laws weren't just about keeping up appearances. They were tools of control designed to make sure everyone stayed in their place visibly. You could tell who was who just by glancing at a person's boots, belt, or hat. Break the rules. You might be fined. Repeatedly violate them. You could be shamed in public or even imprisoned. In Venice, women were once banned from wearing pearls unless they were married into nobility. And the law specifically stated that excess in earrings was a sign of moral decay. Imagine a world where hoop earrings were considered high treason. Historians still argue whether these laws were actually enforced or if they were mostly aspirational. Some towns issued hundreds of proclamations, but rarely followed through. Others had designated fashion inspectors actual people who wandered the streets, peeking under cloaks and measuring sleeve widths. In Florence, tailors were even required by law to snitch on customers who asked for illegal embroidery. And of course, this wasn't just about clothes. Hairstyles, jewelry, the width of your hat brim, everything was regulated. In medieval England, a woman of the merchant class couldn't legally wear a velvet headdress. In Spain, there were rules banning lace cuffs for anyone below the knightly class. It wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a crime. One of the most bizarre examples, in 1363, King Edward III of England passed a law stating that servants couldn't wear anything but rough wool. And if you were a knight, you had to wear cloth according to your estate, which loosely translated to, don't even think about trying that Italian brocade. Even colors had meanings. Scarlet was associated with power and sexuality, and in some towns only certain prostitutes could wear it. If a regular citizen tried to rock red hose, they risked being mistaken for someone, working a very different night shift. And let's not forget the pointy shoes. They were so scandalous that multiple church councils condemned them as weapons of vanity. One French bishop called them devil's talons and claimed they caused men to forget their prayers, which in fairness is probably true if you're too busy tripping over your own feet. What's especially fascinating is that people found clever ways to cheat the system. Some wore forbidden fabrics under their legal outer layers. Others dyed cheap wool to imitate royal purple. A few even bribed officials to turn a blind eye. Because let's be honest, humans have always wanted to look cool, even under threat of fine or flogging. So next time you complain about dress codes or school uniforms, just remember at least no one's checking your hat size against your tax records. Your shoe points have been trimmed to regulation length. Your tunic color no longer suggests you're trying to impersonate royalty, and your hat brim has passed the modesty check. Good. Now don't get cocky, because today you're baking bread, and in medieval Europe, that's a legal minefield. Yes, we're talking about the assize of bread, a set of strange and specific laws that regulated not only what you baked, but how big, how heavy, and even how honest your baking was. And if you thought the fashion police were bad, wait until you meet the bread inspectors. The idea goes like this: bread was the medieval staple food. Everybody ate it, peasants, nobles, monks, beggars. If you messed with the bread, you were messing with survival. So kings and city councils took it very seriously. Passed in England in 1266, and echoed in similar laws across France, Italy, and the German states. The assize of bread set strict standards for bakers. prices were fixed based on the cost of wheat. The weight of your loaf had to match the official table, and heaven forbid you tried to sneak in sawdust or dried beans to pad the dough. Yes, that happened. People got creative when flour was scarce, and if you got caught cheating, the penalties ranged from fines to public humiliation. One of the most common punishments was the pillory, a wooden frame with holes for your hands and head, where you'd be locked for hours while the townspeople threw stale bread at you. Because irony. In more severe cases, crooked bakers were dragged through the streets in a cart with their burnt or undersized loaves hanging around their necks. One chronicler describes a baker in Norwich being paraded past the market with a loaf labeled false weight tied to his tunic like a badge of shame. Historians still argue whether this level of control was about food safety, social justice, or just keeping people from rioting. After all, bad bread could spark real unrest. There are multiple recorded bread riots, especially in times of famine, where citizens stormed bakeries and accused merchants of hoarding flour or watering down the dough. And then there's the quirky solution bakers came up with, the baker's dozen. Ever wonder why that means 13 instead of 12? This is why. To avoid punishment for selling underweight bread, bakers would throw in an extra loaf, or at least a large crusty chunk to make sure they cleared the legal minimum. Better to give too much than risk a run-in with the bread police. One fringe detail. There were specific laws for different kinds of bread. White bread made from sifted flour was often restricted to the wealthy, while coarse black bread, cheaper, heavier, sometimes mixed with rye or barley, was more common among peasants. And yes, selling fancy white bread to someone of the wrong class could get you fined, just like selling velvet cloaks to peasants. There were also religious considerations. During Lent or feast days, bakers had to adjust their recipes to follow fasting rules. If you accidentally baked with lard during Holy Week, well, let's just say you weren't going to be welcome at communion. Even stranger bread testers existed. They were appointed by the city to inspect bakeries, weigh loaves, check ovens, and sometimes taste the goods. If they caught you skimping on flour or cutting corners, they'd file a report, and you'd be lucky to escape with just a fine. Of course, some bakers found clever ways around the law. There are records of loaves being hollowed out, or dough being mixed with ground peas, acorns, or even chalk. One German city had to outlaw bread that crumbled to powder when touched. Makes you appreciate modern preservatives, doesn't it? So next time you casually pick up a baguette at the grocery store, be grateful there's no one weighing it behind you, no pillory waiting outside, and no angry crowd ready to pelt you with crumbs. In medieval Europe, being a baker was risky business. You've survived foot-kissing pig trials, fashion fines, and bread laws, but now we're tiptoeing into far murkier territory, marriage law. Specifically, one of the more disturbing legal norms of medieval Europe, the regulation of wife-beating. Now, before we go any further, take a deep breath. This part of the past is heavy, and yes, it's absolutely as bleak as it sounds. But remember, we're here to explore, not glorify, the absurd and often disturbing ways medieval societies tried to legislate human behavior. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly under English common law and early continental systems, it was legally acceptable for a husband to discipline his wife, within reason. That's right, violence was technically allowed, but there were rules. Because if society is going to be horrifying, it might as well be bureaucratically horrifying. One infamous example is the so-called rule of thumb. While often exaggerated in later retellings, the term has murky historical roots in the idea that a man could beat his wife only with a stick no thicker than his thumb. There's debate among scholars whether this specific phrase ever existed in law, but the concept absolutely did, that certain levels of domestic violence were acceptable, even expected, as long as they didn't cause permanent harm or disrupt the social order. And yes, this was seen as a form of control, not just over the wife, but over the entire household. A man who could not keep his wife in line was seen as weak, incompetent, even laughable. Masculine honor was tied to authority, and the law often backed it up. In 14th century France, a legal code known as the Coutume de Beauvaisis laid out acceptable levels of correction, noting that a husband could beat his wife for disobedience. But if he broke her bones or caused visible disfigurement, he could be punished. Not for the violence itself, mind you, just for going too far. Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced uniformly, or if they existed mostly as theoretical guidelines. Some judges condemned all violence. Others turned a blind eye. There are cases where women brought complaints to court and won compensation, or at least a warning issued to the husband. But there are far more cases where the courts told her to return home and behave. One odd exception: if a wife struck her husband, especially in public, she could face brutal punishment. There are records of women being paraded through the streets, sometimes even riding backwards on a donkey, holding a ladle or broom to signify domestic rebellion. These were meant to shame them back into submission. Now here's a quirky twist. In some rare cases, marital duels were allowed. Yes, actual combat between husband and wife to settle domestic disputes. In 13th century Germany, there's a recorded case where a man was placed in a waist-deep pit with one hand tied behind his back, while his wife stood on the edge with a small club. If she won, he could be executed. If he won, she might be burned. It's less a resolution and more a blood sport with paperwork. Some scholars interpret these laws as the beginning of state interference in private life. For the first time, what happened inside the home was not completely invisible to the law. The state was saying, you may rule your household, but only just so. That said, this was hardly justice. Women, especially peasant and working class women, had little legal recourse. Divorce was nearly impossible. Separation required church approval and often left the woman destitute. The legal system was designed to preserve patriarchal order, not protect individuals. Yet within this grim framework, there were flickers of resistance. Some women did leave abusive husbands and found sanctuary in nunneries or with extended kin. Others wielded community support. Neighbors, parish priests, and local officials occasionally stepped in. There are cases where women banded together to confront violent men and dragged them to court en masse, creating early glimpses of communal justice. So yes, the medieval legal world could be cruel, but it was also complicated. Power wasn't absolute. And even within oppressive systems, people found ways to bend protest, or occasionally even overturn the rules. Still, it's chilling to know that some laws measured morality by inches of wood and bruises you could hide under a sleeve. Let's cleanse the mental palate with something lighter, or so it seems. Because now it's bath time. You're caked in dust from market day, your tunic smells like onions and sheep, and the local bathhouse is beckoning. But beware, it's Tuesday, and in your town, bathing today is illegal. Welcome to one of the more peculiar quirks of medieval municipal law, bathing bans on certain days of the week. Sounds ridiculous, right? But in cities like Paris, Prague, and various towns across the Low Countries, records show that public bathhouses were restricted or outright closed on specific days, particularly Tuesdays and Fridays. The official reason it was to combat immorality, because where there's steam skin and a room full of strangers, well, let's just say things often got slippery. You see, bathhouses weren't just about hygiene. In fact, medieval people bathed more frequently than many of us think, sometimes several times a week. There were elaborate bathhouse rituals with hot steam rooms, cold plunges, massages, and yes, refreshments. In places like southern Germany, people socialized, gossiped, conducted business, and occasionally, negotiated private services behind curtained areas. So authorities cracked down not necessarily on cleanliness, but on the fun that came with it. They worried bathhouses were becoming cover for gambling, drinking, or illicit affairs. One German ordinance from 1413 declared that on Tuesdays the waters are to be left to rest, that modesty may return to the town. As if bathing on a Monday was pious, but doing it on a Tuesday tempted fate. Historians still argue whether these bans were truly moralistic, or just convenient ways to save water, especially in towns with limited supply or seasonal shortages. After all, bathhouses required vast amounts of fuel and water to keep hot, and in cities dependent on public wells, this could strain resources. And then there was the plague. Following the Black Death in the 14th century, some towns believed that open pores could absorb disease and banned bathing entirely during outbreaks. The logic. If your skin was closed up and dirty germs couldn't sneak in. Not exactly sound science, but in an age before germ theory, it made sense to someone. Ironically, bathhouses were often cleaner than most homes. In places like Hungary and the Ottoman-influenced Balkans, public baths were modeled on Roman or Islamic designs, flowing water-tiled walls, and regular cleaning. But once the church started pushing the idea that cleanliness led to vanity, and vanity led to sin, well, cleanliness was no longer next to godliness. It was practically flirting with the devil. One bishop in Florence even preached that a naked man in water is as close to temptation as a coin is to a purse. That's quite the visual metaphor. The rules varied from city to city. Some towns allowed bathing only on feast days. Others restricted gender-mixed bathing to specific hours. And yes, there were bath inspectors who would check if people were obeying both hygiene regulations and modesty codes. In Prague, bathhouse attendants were fined if couples stayed in the same tub too long. Still, people got creative. Bathers would sneak in after hours, bribe attendants, or build private tubs in their homes. Wealthy merchants had indoor copper baths, while peasants made do with wooden barrels. And on no bathing days, there were whispered arrangements. "I'm not washing. I'm soaking my feet," became the medieval equivalent of a loophole. One fringe tidbit. In some places, bathhouses were multi-purpose. After the bathers left, the same steamy space might be rented out for butchering pigs, less fun, or conducting steam-based herbal medicine treatments, still less fun. So if you ever complained about sharing a gym locker room, just be glad no one was slaughtering a hog in the next stall. So as you wipe your brow and sneak back out of the forbidden tub, know this: bathing in medieval Europe wasn't just about staying clean. It was a legal, moral, and sometimes erotic battlefield, where even the days of the week came with rules. And if someone knocks on your door asking why you smell like lavender oil on a Tuesday, deny everything. You're staying in a medieval town now, not a castle or countryside manor. The roads are narrow, lined with wattle and daub homes that lean in over the cobbled streets like gossiping neighbors. You've just finished a hard day hauling water-cleaning chamber pots or kneading gritty dark rye dough into bread. You're about to enjoy the only entertainment of the evening collapsing. But then you hear it. Bong, bong, bong. It's the town bell. And suddenly everything stops. Shutters slam shut. Vendors yank down their stalls. Children scatter like rats in a bakery. You hurry your feet, heart pumping, because you know what that bell means. Curfew. And in medieval Europe, curfew wasn't just a suggestion, it was law. The word curfew actually comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. In theory, the bell signaled townspeople to cover their hearths and douse open flames to prevent nighttime fires. But in practice, it evolved into a full shutdown of public life after sunset. Historians still debate whether the fire prevention motive was the primary driver, or whether it was just a clever excuse for controlling the lower classes after dark. Because here's the deal, after curfew, you weren't just expected to stay home, you were legally required to. Anyone caught outside after the bell could be detained, fined, or worse. Guards or night watchmen patrolled the streets, and if you were out wandering, you'd better have a darn good reason, like being a midwife headed to a birth or chasing a thief. One 14th century English law permitted city officials to imprison anyone found loitering after curfew with no good tale to tell, which sounds less like a statute and more like a bedtime story from someone with a sharp stick. You might think you could whisper your way through a late-night shortcut, but not so fast. Some towns had noise detection rules too. That's right, you could be fined just for talking too loud after curfew. Others went further still. In Cologne and parts of Lombardy, groups of men weren't allowed to congregate at night at all, even in private homes. The fear, secret drinking, secret plots, secret dancing. And if you think public embarrassment is a modern punishment, think again. Some curfew breakers were forced to wear shame masks, oversized iron helmets shaped like pigs, donkeys, or fools. Others were paraded around with lanterns tied to their backs like human streetlights. You're probably wondering, wasn't it dark and dangerous anyway? Who wants to be out after sunset with no streetlights and no police cars? Fair point. But think about traveling merchants, night laborers, and anyone with livestock emergencies. These folks often petitioned for night permits to move about after curfew, and those slips became a hot black market item. And let's not forget the religious exceptions. Pilgrims were sometimes granted passage even after the bell rang, especially if they were on a mission from a monastery or carried the sacred badge of a shrine. But even then, they risked suspicion, because monks weren't the only ones carrying fake relics and shady scrolls. In fact, the nighttime became a whole legal gray zone, and people learned to game it. Some towns developed night codes, sets of unwritten rules passed by word of mouth that let you bend curfew if you knew the right watchman, or brought a loaf of bread to bribe a gatekeeper. And here's a weird one for you. In some coastal towns, mermaids and demons were believed to be especially active after curfew. Laws forbade people from lingering near fountains or lakes, lest they be snatched away by nocturnal spirits. Superstition and civic law waltzed hand in hand under the stars. So yes, that bell you heard wasn't just telling you to snuff out your candles. It was telling you that the town had transformed, slipping into a legally enforced sleep. Step outside that boundary, and the consequences might be humiliating or haunting. You blow out your tallow candle, lie back on your straw mattress, and listen to the night. All is quiet. The world has gone still. You're not just resting. You're obeying the law. You've survived the curfew bell, but you're still wide awake. Maybe you're restless. Maybe the hay mattress is pricklier than you expected. Or maybe it's the rats rustling in the thatch overhead. You whisper to your bedmate or to yourself just to make the night pass a little faster. Bad idea. Because in certain corners of medieval Europe, talking after dark was literally illegal. Welcome to the curious world of the silence laws. It sounds made up, doesn't it? But in several medieval municipalities, particularly religious settlements, isolated hamlets, and even some walled towns, silence wasn't just a spiritual ideal, it was a legal requirement. After sunset, verbal communication outside the home was tightly restricted, sometimes outright banned. You imagine whispering under the stars, maybe murmuring a prayer while feeding your animals. But no, even that could get you fined or publicly shamed in places like 13th century monastic towns or certain alpine villages. Night was sacred. Night was still. Night was supposed to be quiet. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily about discipline, piety, or fear. Some believe the silence laws were enforced to encourage spiritual reflection and discourage idle chatter. Others argue it was a method of social control meant to keep rumors, gossip, and subversion from spreading under the cover of darkness. And if you broke the silence, penalties varied. Some towns issued public penance orders forcing violators to kneel in the town square and confess their nocturnal speech. Others levied small but humiliating noise taxes. And in ultra-strict religious orders, you might even be subjected to temporary vows of silence, yes, as punishment for not being silent enough. You might be thinking, how could they even enforce this, surely? You could just whisper behind closed shutters. Well, that's where it gets even weirder. Some communities had appointed ear-keepers, individuals whose job was to patrol the alleys and listen for nighttime sounds. Kind of like a medieval neighborhood watch, but with sharper hearing and looser standards of evidence. A loud laugh or muttered quarrel might be enough to get your name on a list. And repeat offenders, they could be labeled mouth wanderers, a term found in old city records that basically meant, this guy can't shut up after dusk. In certain noble courts, especially those influenced by Benedictine monastic customs, silence laws were also used to signal hierarchy. High-born nobles could whisper discreetly or send coded hand signs. Servants, not so much. You definitely not. If you were caught whispering near a noble's window after hours, you risked more than a slap on the wrist. You might be accused of plotting or sedition or sorcery. That's not an exaggeration, by the way. In some 14th century German villages, murmuring incantations or charms after sunset was considered a form of witchcraft, especially if livestock went missing the next morning. A little bedtime rhyme could suddenly become evidence at a heresy trial. It didn't stop there. In some places, children were trained in silent obedience, especially girls. A good child, they were told, knew how to listen and not speak once the shadows lengthened. Even lullabies were regulated. Mothers were encouraged to hum rather than sing. The theory, singing at night tempted demons to enter the home through cracked walls or chimneys, cozy right. There are also fringe records from isolated Scottish islands and parts of Sardinia, where silence after sunset was thought to keep away sea spirits. Entire families would stop talking as soon as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Doors were barred. Voices fell to silence. The night became a sacred, wordless veil. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Drunken revelers, traveling performers, and young lovers all took their chances. The difference between a harmless murmur and a punishable offense often came down to who was listening and who you upset. There are medieval court records of people fined not for what they said, but simply for being overheard speaking at the wrong hour. Still, for many, The law wasn't just enforced, it was internalized. Generations grew up believing that words belonged to the light and silence to the dark. And so you can imagine a town falling into hush after curfew, no voices in the street, no songs from balconies, only the occasional hoot of an owl or the drip of water from a broken pipe. A living silence. You try not to think about how many people lived their entire lives without ever speaking past sundown. You roll onto your side. The walls are thin. You hear the neighbor's goat snort in the stable below. But you don't dare whisper. Just in case someone's listening, you wake up early if you slept at all, and stretch in your straw-stuffed bed lungs, filling with the cool morning air. But hold up. That breath you just took, it's not free. Not in certain corners of medieval Europe. Today, we talk about weird taxes on air, water, sunlight, and basically anything the human body needs to survive. See, in your mind, taxation is tied to property, income, trade, right? But in the patchwork legal chaos of medieval Europe, lords, kings, and councils taxed whatever they could get away with. If something could be measured, consumed, or claimed as divine right, it could be taxed, including the basics of existence. Let's start with water. In places like 14th century Paris, you couldn't just wander down to the Seine and splash around. Access to clean flowing water was regulated sometimes by guilds, other times by noble decree. If you wanted to use public fountains, you paid a bucket tax. If you owned a well, you might still have to pay a flow fee to the local lord because technically he owned the groundwater beneath your house. One record from Florence mentions an innkeeper fined for letting travelers drink from the kitchen cistern without charging them. That's right, giving away water could get you penalized. And air. Oh yes, even the air was monetized, at least indirectly. In dense urban areas like London, Bruges, or Cologne, households were taxed based on how much ventilation they had. The logic windows and chimneys made the air around your home more pleasant, so you owed more. Some cities levied smoke taxes fees based on how much smoke escaped from your chimney because that smoke polluted communal air. Others had roofline levies charging more if your home allowed an excessive light or breezes. You couldn't win if your house was dark and dank, you were fined for being unhealthy. If it was sunny and airy, you were fined for luxury. Historians still debate whether these air and water taxes were about actual health concerns, revenue generation, or just petty control by urban authorities. Most agree it was a messy blend of all three. Then there was the river tax. Use a public stream to wash your laundry. Pay up. Want to water your oxen or cool down on a summer day? You guessed it, another fee. Millers had to pay for how fast water flowed past their wheels. Fishermen paid per net, per tide, and per fish species. In some Swiss villages, you could be fined for singing near a stream because loud noise was said to scare away fish. You might laugh, but there are documented cases of traveling minstrels being run out of town by angry anglers. But the strangest of all might be the airspace taxes found in parts of 15th century Italy. Imagine this, you build a house with a second-story overhang, a bit of extra architecture hanging out over the street to create more living space above. Makes sense in a crowded city. But the city council, they charge you rent for the air below your beams. After all, you are now occupying public space even if it was just empty air. There are quirky town records in Bologna and Lucca listing these fees in square cubits of borrowed air. And don't get smug. It wasn't just noblemen paying. Poor families who extended so much as a drying rack or a flower box over the street could be fined. That same logic applied to bridges too. A merchant stall built on a bridge, airspace rent. A plank sticking out into the market square, rent. A string for drying onions stretched from one window to another, rent for the air between them. And lest you think villagers were spared this nonsense, think again. In some rural areas, you paid a sun tax if your land happened to get more daylight than your neighbors. A warm hillside vineyard might come with a premium justified by its superior solar exposure. You can imagine the debates this sparked. Landowners squabbling over whose fields were overly illuminated sounds like a Monty Python sketch, but it's real. These strange taxes weren't just about greed. They reinforced hierarchy. Wealthy people could afford to keep breathing, bathing, and basking in the sun. Poor folks, not so much. Over time, they learned to ration everything, even joy. One fringe document from northern Spain details a wind tariff, a tax on windmills operating during stormy seasons. Too much wind meant too much flour, which meant too much prosperity, and that had to be curtailed. Still, communities resisted. Secret fountains were built in back alleys. People took to bathing at dawn. And you, weary traveler, would have to learn the tricks. Collect rainwater in barrels. Close your shutters when the tax inspector comes by. And whatever you do, don't sing near the river, because in this world, even the breeze costs money. You rise before the rooster crows, rubbing your eyes with the rough edge of your sleeve. The light is gray and cold, the hearth long extinguished. You're hungry, but not just missed breakfast hungry. No, this is bone-deep growling, gnawing medieval hunger, and it's your constant companion. Because in the Middle Ages, you are almost always starving. Let's get this straight, not everyone was emaciated. But for the vast majority, especially peasants, day laborers, monks, and servants, chronic undernourishment was the norm. Food wasn't simply scarce. It was unreliable, heavily seasonal, and often deliberately restricted by law or custom. You eat what you're given. You eat when there is something, and when there isn't, you pray. Your daily bread, literally, the center of your diet, isn't fluffy or warm. It's coarse, dense, sometimes more bran than grain. If you're lucky, it's made with rye or barley. If you're not, it's bulked with ground beans, sawdust, or even powdered bark. That loaf you hold in your hand might be last week's, hard as stone. Chewing it could crack a tooth. You dunk it in weak beer or boil it into porridge just to make it edible. And yet, that bread is precious. There are entire laws, assizes of bread written to regulate its weight, its price, and its contents. Bake it too small, you're fined. Sell it too large, you're accused of cheating the guild. Bread was governmentally monitored because it kept entire towns from rioting. Protein rare. Meat. Forget it. Maybe once a month you'll gnaw on a dried herring or a sliver of bacon. And even then, only after it's been boiled 3 times to soften it. More likely, you're eating pottage, a soupy porridge-like slurry of boiled grains and whatever vegetables are in season, turnips, leeks, maybe onion if you're lucky. It simmers all day over the fire. You keep adding water and scraps day after day until it becomes more ritual than recipe. In some households, a pottage could be kept going for weeks, each meal drawing from the same ever-thickening pot. And then there's fasting, not a health trend, but a way of life. In religious communities and cities governed by church calendars, you might go over 150 days per year without eating meat, dairy, or eggs. That includes every Friday, all of Lent, Advent, certain Wednesdays, the eves of Saints' days, and more. Now imagine doing this without knowing whether the next harvest will succeed. Crop failure is constant hailstorms, blight, flooding, drought. One summer without rain, and the whole region teeters on famine. Rats swarm the fields. Grain prices skyrocket. You start eating acorns, boiled thistle, even clay. In one record from 1315 during the Great Famine, parents in northern France were selling their children just to get enough bread to live. Other documents mention digging up fresh graves or murdering travelers for food. You clutch your stomach and hope it rains. And even in the good years, it's not like the food is clean. Everything is adulterated. Flour is cut with chalk, wine with lead, salted fish crawling with worms. If you complain, you're told to give thanks for what you have. At court, feasting is loud and luxurious, but it's also decadent waste. While you scrounge for wild garlic, nobles are tossing entire roast birds onto the floor half-eaten. During one coronation feast in England, the scraps from the table could have fed 1,000 peasants. Instead, they're swept out for the dogs. And don't think you can just hunt your own food. Game belongs to the Lord. Poaching is a hanging offense. Yes, even if you're starving. You're probably not drinking much water either. It's often contaminated with animal waste, human filth, or rot. So you drink weak ale or thin wine. Even children drink beer not for the buzz, but because it's safer than the well. And if you live near a monastery or in a port town, maybe you've seen the miracle of spices, saffron, pepper, cinnamon, cloves. But they're not for you. They're worth their weight in gold. A single clove could cost more than your day's wage. You might smell it on a noble's breath and weep. Hunger in this world isn't just a physical pain. It's a daily humiliation. Your belly marks your place in society. A plump stomach means wealth, divine favor, abundance. A hollow one, you're just another body waiting for the plague to make room. And the worst part, when there is a feast day, when bread and honey and butter and roasted goose are passed around the village square, you're so unaccustomed to eating well that it makes you sick. Your own body rejects plenty. You lean against the doorframe, dizzy. The morning sun has fully risen, but your stomach still groans. You chew slowly on your crust of yesterday's bread and dream of someday, just someday, being full. You spit into your palm, rub your boots with the damp, and step out into the bustling street, if it can be called that. A muddy vein of filth winding through the center of town, lined with leaning wood and wattle houses that look like they're one strong gust away from collapse. You're on your way to market, or to church, or perhaps to find a day's work. But it's not just the weather or war or hunger you need to watch out for. You also have to survive the laws. And not just the big obvious ones about theft or murder. No, these are the strangely specific, frequently absurd, and sometimes downright inexplicable regulations that shape every step you take. Like this one in 14th century London, it was illegal to wear pointy shoes that were longer than 2 inches beyond your toes. They were called crackles, and the city just had enough. The ruling said the shoes were vain and dishonest. Why historians still argue whether it was for religious modesty, urban tripping hazards, or just sheer aesthetic offense. Or how about sumptuary laws, those rigid social codes that dictated exactly what you could wear depending on your class? You want to put on a bit of velvet. Sorry, peasant. Only knights and lords are allowed to strut in that. Fur trim only if you make more than 100 pounds a year. And don't you dare wear purple silk unless you're literal royalty. Dress above your station and you'll be fined or even jailed. The logic was simple. Clothing is status, and status must be visible at a glance. Your neighbors keep a close eye on you too. In many towns, it was forbidden to walk the streets after sunset, unless you carried a lantern or were accompanied by someone with a reputation. That law wasn't just for safety, it was about control. Authorities were terrified of unseen people doing unapproved things in the dark. If a night watchman spotted you alone, you'd be detained until morning. Even more bizarre in parts of Italy and France, it was illegal to whistle indoors, particularly near religious sites. Superstition claimed whistling invited demons. A whistling apprentice could be flogged for summoning evil. And then there's the fish laws. Yes, fish. During Lent and other fasting periods, towns passed legislation demanding that people eat fish and only fish on specific days. Not obeying could get you excommunicated, fined, or even imprisoned. Butchers who sold meat on a forbidden day publicly shamed or worse. Let's say you're a baker instead. Think your bread is your business. Think again. As you recall from earlier, baking was hyper-regulated. If your loaf weighed under the legal limit, not only could you lose your license, you might get the humiliating punishment of being tied to your bakery door with your underweight loaves hung around your neck. And if you're selling wine or ale, be very careful with your measures. Short pouring a mug or watering down ale was treated almost like treason. Standard tankards and jugs were inspected with metal gauges. Dishonest taverners were locked in stocks with signs labeling them false measure. Now brace yourself for this one. In some towns in Flanders and Germany, it was forbidden for women to knit during Holy Week, especially in public. The logic knitting was considered a worldly task, and women were expected to focus entirely on prayer and confession. Then there are the noise laws. In certain market towns, singing bawdy songs after sunset could get you thrown in jail for disturbing the peace. Peace being defined, of course, by the town aldermen, most of whom were completely deaf to joy. What if you're a pig farmer? In London, your pigs can't roam free. By decree of King Edward II, any pig found wandering the streets could be seized and executed. Seriously. They even had official pig executioners. Some towns would fine you, then eat your pig. Others just hanged it. Yes, hanged the pig. But it gets darker. Medieval Europe also featured animal trials. If your goat kicked a friar or your donkey wandered into a garden and nibbled holy herbs, the animal could be tried in court with a legal defender, witnesses, and all. Cats, cows, and even rats were summoned before magistrates. One record shows a pig being hanged for the crime of infanticide. Historians still argue whether these were genuine beliefs or elaborate social theater, but they happened. Let's swing to Switzerland. In the town of Schaffhausen, it was illegal to slam your door after dark. Too disruptive, too aggressive. First offense, a fine. Second, you're shoveling snow for a week. And in parts of France, married couples were required to sleep with their bedroom door open on certain feast nights, so neighbors could confirm that no sinful avoidance of marital duties was occurring. Yep, no privacy, no pressure. All of this sounds ridiculous to your modern ears, but in a world of plague, poor records, tight social hierarchies, and overwhelming superstition, these laws weren't just about control. They were about making the invisible visible, public morality, public order, public reputation. Still, as you step over another puddle of slop in the street and avoid eye contact with the guildmaster's wife, whose hat may or may not exceed the legal height limit, you can't help but wonder, are you breaking any laws right now? You wake to bells. low, mournful ones echoing off the stone walls of the town like distant thunder. It's not a market day, those have a jollier clang. No, this is a warning, a curfew bell, or maybe the town crier's summons. But as you peer out the shutter, you realize no one's moving. Doors are closed, curtains drawn. Something is happening, and that something is justice, or what passes for it here. In the center of the square, a wooden platform has been assembled, rough splintered beams cobbled together in haste. The crowd gathers in silence. They've seen this before. You elbow your way forward just enough to glimpse a man bound at the wrists, standing beside the bailiff. His offense, not murder, not theft. He stole bread from a priest, and worse, he refused to confess. See, in this world, punishment isn't just about the crime, it's about spectacle. Justice must be seen. That's why executions are public. That's why you might be fined for fighting, but whipped for fighting in daylight. That's why your punishment might include a sign describing your crime hung around your neck as townsfolk jeer and throw stale leaks. Take the pillory, for example. You're shoved in hands and neck, locked in place, exposed to the town's collective rage. Children throw eggs. Adults shout slurs. If it rains, you get soaked. If it's sunny, you burn. You are the moral lesson of the week. And that's if you're lucky. More severe branding. In many towns, repeat offenders were literally marked with hot irons. A thief might get a T on the cheek, a blasphemer a B on the hand. Think of it as a medieval Yelp review you can never remove, and the branding iron. It was often blessed by a priest, as if divine approval sealed your fate. But you don't even need to break a big law. Being annoying might be enough. In some towns, gossiping too loudly could earn you the scold's bridle, a metal cage clamped over your head with a tongue piece to suppress speech. You'd be paraded through the streets in silence, eyes watering, while children laughed. Historians still argue whether it was more psychological punishment than physical. But either way, you'd never speak casually again. And what if you were a baker caught cheating your measures? Like we said earlier, you'd be tied to your door with the undersized loaf displayed on a pole. But in Germany, some towns had a special dunking chair. You'd be dunked repeatedly in a freezing river while people cheered. Public humiliation was therapeutic, apparently. Not all punishments were degrading. Some were meant to terrify. Imagine being led to the gallows with a priest chanting your sins aloud. Or worse, being sentenced to banishment, forced to leave town forever, under threat of execution if you return. To vanish in the Middle Ages, that was almost as good as death. And then there were the trial methods themselves. The very process of justice was frankly unhinged. Trial by ordeal, classic. You'd stick your hand in boiling water. If it healed clean, God declared you innocent. If it blistered or festered, guilty. Or you might be tied up and thrown into a river. If you sank, you were innocent, but also very dead. If you floated, you were a witch. So, not much of a win either way. One German town believed in trial by cheese. The accused had to eat a piece of dry cheese with a feather hidden inside. If they choked or turned pale, guilty. If they swallowed it smoothly, God was on their side. Honestly, that one might be the fairest of the lot. And don't forget, collective punishment. If a thief wasn't caught, the whole town might be fined. Or if someone in your household committed a crime, you might be lashed as well. The message, keep your people in line or suffer. But let's not pretend all of this was heartless. Medieval towns did have mercy systems. You might be granted sanctuary in a church, given time to flee, or offered leniency if you could convince the local lord of your value. Some lords even issued letters of pardon for the right price. Justice was firm but flexible for the right coin. So as the bells fade and the crowd disperses, you ask yourself the real question: was this man's punishment just, did he deserve the stocks for stealing bread? Or was this just society putting on a show, trying to keep everyone in line? You'll never know for sure. But one thing is clear: you live in a world where fear, shame, and ritual are as important as law. And tomorrow the bell will ring again. Word count 160. Wind down. Final 300 words. Now, as the cobblestones grow quiet beneath the moon, and the torchlight flickers gently on the chapel walls, you finally step away from the crowd. The square empties like breath exhaled from a sleeping town, and you feel that heavy calm descend once more. You walk slowly, careful not to scuff your boots too loud, careful not to attract unnecessary attention. A cool breeze brushes past your face, carrying with it the scent of burnt tallow and early morning bread, an oddly comforting blend. The weight of the day lingers in your shoulders, but you let it ease. You're still here, still unpunished. Let your breathing slow. The world of rules and rituals, of whispers and walls of punishments and pointed shoes, it begins to fade. The bells are silent now. The bridle has been put away. The judges, the priests, the merchants, all are asleep. And soon so are you. You did well tonight. You listened, you learned, and most importantly, you survived. And as you pull your blanket up to your chin, hear this last soft whisper from the medieval dark. Even in the strangest times, people still laughed, still loved, and still dreamed of mornings without fear. Good night, traveler. End of script. Sweet dreams. Hoi ChatGPT.